Yeah, I'm ready.
The Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement, and Intelligence will come to order. Without objection, the chair may declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony from a non-governmental panel of expert witnesses to examine the terrorism threats posed by jihadist groups in Africa and their implications on U.S. homeland security and our interest. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning and welcome to the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement, and Intelligence. We're holding this important hearing to examine and discuss the rising threats posed by terrorist groups in Africa and its impact on the security of our homeland and Americans abroad. This is a topic of critical importance, not only to this committee and this subcommittee, but also, I think, to our entire country. In fact, it was this subcommittee that held the very first congressional hearing about Boko Haram, who refers to itself as the Nigerian Taliban, and has been designated a foreign terrorist organization for its terrorist attacks. Why are we here? Over 30 years ago, terrorists trained at an al-Qaeda training camp. Terrorists who were trained at an al-Qaeda training camp in Afghanistan carried out a car bombing at the World Trade Center. The bombing resulted in the deaths of 6 people and injured thousands of Americans. 8 years later, 19 terrorists that were motivated by the same radical ideological beliefs hijacked 4 commercial airliners and carried out the largest terrorist attacks on American soil on September 11th. And just a short while ago, Homeland Security Committee members led by Subcommittee Chairman Anthony D'Esposito commemorated the 22nd anniversary of those attacks on 9/11 at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in Lower Manhattan. Members honored the memory of the victims and thanked the first responders for their dedicated services. During the period between the first attack on the World Trade Center and 9/11, our nation did not fully comprehend the threats posed by the Salafi jihadist movement or identify the warning signs or threat indicators that could have helped degrade al-Qaeda's operational capacities and capabilities. We must learn from these past gaps, some would call them failures, and have proactive conversations to not only identify these threats, but appropriately confront them before they metastasize. Political instability, dire economic conditions, sectarian violence, mass migration, and an anti-Western sentiment are just some of the main factors that contribute to individuals radicalizing and joining jihadist movements to commit violence. The unfortunate reality is that many African nations share these underlying factors that contribute to the rise of extremism. These conditions are not new and have been present on the continent for decades. 2 notable events have especially defined today's terrorism threat landscape throughout Africa. First, on October 3rd, 1993, American forces helping with U.S. peacekeeping operations in Mogadishu were attacked by Somali National Alliance, whose fighters were trained and equipped by al-Qaeda. 18 Americans died and 73 others were injured. To this day, the Battle of Mogadishu is still one of the deadliest days in the history of the U.S. operations, Special Force operations. American forces were again attacked by jihadists on October 4th, 2017 in Niger. Now known as the Tongo ambush, U.S. Army special operators and Nigerian troops were ambushed by Islamic State militants while out conducting an operation to capture Islamic State in the Greater Sahel, Commander Dawandu Shafau. 4 Americans and 4 Nigerians were killed that day, and 8 Nigerians and 2 Americans were wounded. Both the Battle of Mogadishu and the Tongo ambush were galvanizing inflection points for the jihadist movements in Africa and helped contribute to the rise of the terror networks across the continent. Regional instability has also fueled the terror threat landscape across Africa. After the collapse of ISIS caliphate in Syria and Iraq, many of the jihadists escaped to various countries throughout Africa. These insurgents have wreaked havoc across the continent, forcing governments to develop and enhance their counterterrorism capabilities. Our nation has helped lead these efforts. In fact, we have kept 2 bases in Niger with about 1,000 men and women of our military deployed there with counterterrorism and an intelligence mission across the broader region. However, near-peer competitors, both China and Russia, have also rushed to help fill this power vacuum. Russia has exploited corrupt African governments with checkered human rights records into allowing their nation's counterterrorism, quote unquote, counterterrorism efforts to be supported by Russian paramilitary groups. Most notably, Russia's Wagner Group, a private military company, have not only provided counterterrorism capabilities, but have also been used to prop up ruthless authoritarian figures. In return, Russian PMCs gain access to gold, to diamonds, critical mineral mines, and many other resources. And these resources have helped keep the Russian economy afloat and has helped fuel their unjust and provocative war in Ukraine. The nefarious actions and human rights abuses by foreign malign nation states have turned local populations towards jihadist groups for protection. The United States cannot continue to allow Russian PMCs or CCP groups to fill this power vacuum. We must provide viable alternatives to these arrangements and encourage our African partners to work with us and embrace our shared democratic values to stop the spread of the jihadi movement. This hearing today is an important subject that I'm personally familiar with, having served myself in the Middle East, having served in operations against ISIS throughout Iraq and Syria. I know firsthand just how deadly these periods of time can be when you have the ability for these groups to grow unchecked and to not have the appropriate partnerships abroad. Our African partners must not fall victim to the sheer brutality of these jihadist groups or allow anywhere on the continent to become a new breeding ground for extremism. I hope today that we can have an open and an honest dialogue on this issue. This is not a partisan issue. This has nothing to do with Republican versus Democrat politics. This is all about the security of the United States. It's all about the security of our partners who value freedom, who value the Western mentality of pushing back on groups that would harm not only our partners, but the innocent lives of so many people throughout the world. We're absolutely delighted to have a distinguished panel with plenty of experience to give us your thoughts and your recommendations as to where we should go. And lastly, I'll say, you think about these hearings and what they mean to our country. And even though some of these don't get the press or the publicity, they are vitally important for my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to hear the facts. We cannot allow these interim periods of time in between conflicts like what 9/11 brought to this country, to have a breeding ground where extremism wins out. We must remain vigilant. That's why we're holding this hearing. What keeps me up at night is the thought that these groups who do have a track record and have the absolute motivation to harm Americans, to harm the American way of life, to harm our partners, that's what keeps me up at night, is thinking about those places on earth that we're not thinking about, that we don't have visibility into, and what can we be doing alongside our partners, and especially in Africa, to help prevent those things from metastasizing. I want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning, and I look forward to a good, robust discussion. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Magaziner, for his opening statement.
Good morning. I want to thank Chairman Pfluger for calling this important hearing and thank our witnesses for coming today. Terrorism is increasing across the continent of Africa, making this a critical and timely oversight topic for this committee. Last month marked the 25th anniversary of the bombing of U.S. embassies in East Africa, where 224 people were killed, including 12 Americans, and more than 4,500 people were wounded. The embassy bombings were orchestrated by Osama bin Laden, who would later direct the most heinous, most deadly terrorist attack on U.S. soil on September 11th, 2001. While the United States was reeling from the 9/11 attacks and focusing our counterterrorism efforts in the Middle East and Central Asia, bin Laden and al-Qaeda were looking towards Somalia and Yemen. Today, terrorist groups have established themselves in those countries and are focused on further expanding their reach through brutal violence in the Sahel and West Africa. The reality is that 22 years after the 9/11 attacks, al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates are still active, especially in Africa, and newer terrorist organizations have emerged to spread to the African continent as well. Al-Qaeda's richest and most successful affiliate, al-Shabaab, today controls large territories in Somalia, despite more than 15 years of military operations and airstrikes, and has also killed U.S. citizens, soldiers, and contractors in Kenya. 10 years ago last week marked the anniversary of the Westgate shopping mall attack, where 64 people died at the hands of al-Shabaab terrorists. Al-Shabaab has launched an incursion of as many as 2,000 terrorist fighters deep into Ethiopia, and it has killed thousands of people in attacks across Somalia. Another al-Qaeda affiliate, JNIM, operates in West Africa, and particularly in the nations of Mali and Burkina Faso. JNIM has attacked French, UN, and local security force personnel, has brutally murdered civilians accused of collaborating with the state, and has encircled the capital of Mali while spreading deeper into the Sahel and southward into coastal West Africa. And al-Qaeda and its affiliates are not the only terrorist organizations in Africa that conspire to attack Americans. Over the past 7 years, ISIS has spread its influence throughout the Sahel region. ISIS Sahel has predominantly focused on local targets in the border areas of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, but the group has claimed credit for killing 4 U.S. soldiers and kidnapping at least 1 U.S. citizen. And in Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, Islamic State West Africa has established itself as a leading extremist group in the region. Now, these threats may seem far away from the U.S. homeland, but we must be clear-eyed that what is happening in Africa affects our security here at home. Though the intelligence community assesses that Africa-based violent extremist groups are primarily threats to the regions in which they operate, these terrorist organizations seek to target Americans and no doubt would take advantage of any opportunity to bring their reign of terror to our homeland as well. In addition to working with friendly governments in Africa to crack down on terrorism, we must redouble our efforts to combat terrorist groups' ability to radicalize individuals in the United States through the internet as well. We know that al-Shabaab and ISIS have recruited American citizens and citizens of other Western countries to engage in terrorism domestically, using social media to encourage sympathetic or troubled individuals to attack targets here in the United States. Furthermore, we know that these terrorist groups often rely on Americans and other Westerners to help fund their operations. I hope that we take the opportunity during today's hearing to discuss this, how we can counter foreign terrorist groups' unprecedented virtual access to people in the United States in further of inspiring and enabling attacks on the homeland. I'm thankful that the Biden administration is taking the threat from the rise in terrorism across Africa seriously. Today we have around 450 military personnel on the ground advising Somali forces and African Union troops to beat back al-Shabaab and bring stability to the Horn of Africa. We also have approximately 1,100 military personnel in Niger conducting drone operations to combat terrorism. The United States continues to launch airstrikes against al-Shabaab when necessary, and we are advising, assisting, accompanying, training, and equipping regional forces to carry out counterterrorism operations that protect the security of African nations and prevent the spread of terrorism to the United States and our allies. While military options are necessary to counter terrorism in Africa, the United States must also help African nations build their democratic institutions and improve the lives of their citizens in order to foster stability. If we do not continue to engage with robust foreign aid, adversaries like Russia and China will continue to fill that void, and terrorist organizations like al-Qaeda and ISIS will continue to gain strength. It is in America's national security interest to be a good partner to those nations in Africa who are aligned with our values. Today's hearing is an important opportunity for members of this subcommittee to demonstrate that we are united in a bipartisan effort to defend the American people, protect the homeland, and ensure the security of African nations from terrorist threats. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Magaziner. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic, and I ask that at this time the witnesses please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. I'd now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Dr. John Peter Pham previously served as the United States Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region of Africa and as the Special Envoy of the Sahel region of Africa from 2018 to 2020. During this time, Ambassador Pham was responsible for coordinating and executing the United States strategy in the region to advance peace, stability, and our nation's interest in the region. Prior to being confirmed as ambassador, Ambassador Pham served as Vice President for Research and Regional Initiatives at the Atlantic Council, where he currently serves as a distinguished fellow. He has also served as Vice President for the National Committee on American Foreign Policy Interest and as a Senior Advisor to U.S. AFRICOM. Lastly, he is a tenured professor at James Madison University, where he taught courses related to justice studies, political science, Africana studies, and led the Nelson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Welcome. Mr. Joshua Maservi is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he focuses his research on great power competition in Africa, African geopolitics, and counterterrorism. He has also served as a research fellow for Africa at the Heritage Foundation and has worked at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center and U.S. Army Special Operations Command. He has also served in the Peace Corps, where he was stationed in Zambia. Welcome. Dr. Aaron Zellin serves as the Richard Barrow Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he also directs the Islamic State Worldwide Activity Map Project. He is a visiting research scholar at Brandeis University. Dr. Zellin is a published author and has written extensively on the jihadist threat landscape. He earned his PhD in War Studies from the King's College in London in December of 2017, and his dissertation on the history of the Tunisian jihadi movement was nominated for King's College London Graduate School Prize for the Outstanding PhD thesis. And I may also mention that we were colleagues at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy while I was a visiting fellow there, and I'd like to thank Robert Satloff and Michael Singh for their efforts as well. Welcome. Our fourth witness today is Ms. Donna Charles, who serves as the Director of the West Africa and Sahel Programs for the United States Institute of Peace. Prior to joining the United States Institute of Peace, Ms. Charles served as a professional staff member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where she handled issues pertaining to Africa and UN peacekeeping efforts. In addition, she has spent nearly a decade with the State Department in various roles pertaining to African affairs, counterterrorism policy, and sanctions. Ms. Charles is also a veteran, and we appreciate your service through the United States Air Force. Thank you for being here. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here. You have submitted great written testimonies. However, I would ask you to please summarize those in a 5-minute period, which I know is very difficult at times. But I would like to now recognize Dr. Pham for your 5 minutes opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Permit me to begin by thanking you not only for the opportunity to testify before you today on the subject of the rise of terrorism in Africa and its impact on the security of our American homeland, but also for the sustained attention which the United States House of Representatives has given to this challenge over the years. As the title of this hearing correctly suggests, there is indeed a rise in terrorist activity in Africa, and it does impact the future security of our homeland. Let me address both of these in turn. First, while thankfully the number of deaths caused by terrorism around the globe has been on the decline the last several years, although of course even one death is too many, the progress is uneven. In Africa, the trend has been sadly of increased violence, with the Sahel region in particular witnessing a significant deterioration last year, according to the data set of the Global Terrorism Index. In fact, just 2 Sahelian countries, Burkina Faso and Mali, alone accounted for 1/3 of all deaths from terrorism around the world. It's not just the sheer number of deaths has increased from the year before, but the terrorist attacks themselves have become more lethal. There is one counterterrorism good news story from Africa in 2022, and that was Niger, which saw a 79% decrease in deaths from terrorism. Alas, the coup in that country exactly 2 months ago risks undoing that progress. Second, while the Sahel appears remote superficially to America, it's worth remembering that the centuries-old trade routes leading across the Sahara Desert to the Mediterranean and beyond to Europe run across this region. Today, those ancient paths are used both for human trafficking and the smuggling of drugs and other contraband to Europe, and thus represent a vulnerability to a number of U.S. allies. In addition, in the wake of the pivot from their dependence on Russian oil and gas, many of our European allies have come to rely on energy exported from West African producers via pipelines that traverse the Sahel region. For these and other strategic reasons, the United States has maintained 2 bases in Niger, with approximately 1,000 men and women of our armed forces deployed there, with a mission of both intelligence gathering and counterterrorism across the wider region that has become invaluable and will prove even more so in the weeks and months ahead, given French President Macron's announcement this past weekend of a pullout of his country's military forces in Niger by the end of the year. And while the regional affiliates of al-Qaeda and the Islamic State constitute much of the infrastructure for terrorism and violent extremism in the Sahel and across Africa, do not presently appear to have the capability to attack our American homeland, that doesn't mean they would not if somehow, God forbid, they come into those means. Moreover, there are U.S. citizens well within their reach, as the long ordeal of aid worker Jeff Woodkey, held captive for over 6 years after he was kidnapped from Niamey, Niger, underscored, as well as significant American economic and other interests across the African continent, including in countries where terrorist groups have been stepping up attacks in recent years. If you may, let me pivot to offering several considerations about the U.S. response to terrorism in Africa and the possible threat this phenomenon poses to American citizens and interests, as well as to our homeland. First, time and again, the mistake has been made to underestimate, if not entirely discount, the threat faced. Part of this is attributable to an analytical bias to limit future possibilities to extrapolations from the past, a hermeneutical choice that ignores the dynamic potential of many of these terrorist organizations. Another part of the explanation is much more basic: the sheer lack of resources for Africa-related intelligence and analysis across the whole of the U.S. government. Given the geopolitical, economic, and security stakes, the failure to invest more in institutions and personnel and training and strategic focus is incredibly short-sighted. Second, with the exception of the Department of Defense, across the U.S. government, there's an artificial division of the continent that frankly is rejected by not only Africans, but it's also unhelpful. In reality, there are few compelling geopolitical, economic, or strategic reasons to separate the North African countries from the rest of the African continent. Third, bureaucratic structures are only of value insofar as the positions therein are filled by qualified individuals. Without getting polemics about decision-making in the current administration or political dynamics in the Senate, permit me to simply observe that it doesn't serve America's interest to leave key positions unfilled. Fourth, closely related to terrorism is the danger posed by the lack of effective sovereignty that bedevils many African governments. Often, the challenge manifests itself in criminality. Other times, it's the lack of capacity to provide citizens with basic goods and services. Fifth, as America's relationships, diplomatic, security, economic, and cultural with Africa as a whole and with individual countries expands and deepens, a positive development to be sure. An unfortunate downside is the potential risks to U.S. persons and interests as well as the homeland necessarily increase. Quite simply, the threats exist and more engagement by its very nature increases exposure and vulnerability. And just 2 more points. 6, with supply chains for critical minerals needed both for energy transition and new technologies running across Africa, I'd invite this distinguished panel to consider a broader vision of security, not just protecting American people and homeland from attacks, but protecting our access to the strategic materials which are essential for our defense systems and our civilian economy. Finally, the challenge of terrorism in Africa and any derivative threat to the United States cannot be addressed except, as the ranking member rightly pointed out, in an integrated fashion, with solutions that embrace a broader notion of human security writ large, encompassing social, economic, and political development, which often enough must transcend national and other boundaries. I repeatedly emphasized during my service as envoy to the Sahel, the crisis in the Sahel is one of state legitimacy, a perception by citizens that their governments are valid, equitable, and able and willing to meet their needs. Absent states' commitment to meeting their citizens' needs, no degree of international engagement is likely to succeed. This obviously is not a task for the U.S. alone. Nonetheless, it's one which America has a strategic interest
Ambassador,
in embracing
I'm sorry to interrupt. We're gonna have to keep moving, okay?
and leading. That was my final. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Joshua Meservey for your 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important topic. My name is Joshua Meservey. I'm a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. The views I express in this testimony are my own and do not represent an official position at Hudson. African terrorism is amid an extraordinary expansion. According to the latest Global Terrorism Index, in 2022, the Sahel was the site of 43% of all terrorism deaths worldwide, up from 1% in 2007, while sub-Saharan Africa as a whole accounted for 60% of all terrorism deaths last year. There are also now deadly and active Islamist terrorists operating in parts of Africa, such as northern Mozambique and eastern DRC, that have little history of Islamist terrorism. These trends challenge the U.S.'s ability to protect the American homeland, as Islamist terrorist Salafi jihadi theology requires them to fight the United States. African Islamic State and al-Qaeda affiliates are largely autonomous, and not all members subscribe to Salafi jihadi theology, but the core leadership behaves as though they do. American policymakers should assume that an African terrorist organization would attack the United States if given the chance. Furthermore, as Chairman Pfluger noted in his opening remarks, there are now vast spaces in Mali and Burkina Faso that can serve as the type of safe havens where terrorists have the time and space to plot more ambitious attacks. The relatively good news is that the direct threat of African terrorism to the homeland is, for now, limited for various reasons. The risk of American complacency and distraction is real, however. Lone wolf terror attacks likely remain the most direct danger from African terrorism to the homeland. Fortunately, there does not appear to be any African terrorist organization with significant appeal within the U.S. right now. While African terrorism's most potent threats to the U.S. are more indirect than an attack on the homeland, they are still worrisome. They include, 1, attacking Americans and American interests on the continent, something terrorist groups have done for decades. 2, providing military leaders with a pretext for launching coups. The putschists in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger all invoke their country's worsening terrorism-fueled insecurity as justification for taking power. 3, creating the type of instability that provides opportunities for American competitors like Russia through its Wagner Group. 4, undermining important economic projects, such as how ASWJ in northern Mozambique shut down operations around a massive natural gas field in the area. Unfortunately, current trends in Africa suggest that these dangers will likely grow. The dismal state of governance on the continent, of which the recent rash of coups is both symptom and cause, enhances the appeal of terrorist messaging. Furthermore, the Wagner Group, to which some governments have turned, operates in ways that exacerbates the governance deficiencies that contribute to terrorism in the first place. Meanwhile, this is happening against a backdrop of the rapid growth of Salafism in Africa that has widened the pool of Muslims who share some core theological beliefs with Salafi jihadis. Bearing in mind that the most effective interventions will enhance what viable and committed governments, militaries, civil society, and ordinary citizens are already trying to achieve on the ground in terrorism-affected areas, the U.S. should, 1, coordinate the fight against terrorism with partners and allies. The problem of African terrorism is far too large for the U.S. alone. 2, cooperate with the remaining relatively stable West African countries to build a terrorism firebreak. 3, hold Middle Eastern countries to their promises to stop funding extremism, including the proselytization of fundamentalist Islam. This appears to be less of a problem now than it was a decade ago, but it requires continued attention. 4, ensure adequate religious literacy among U.S. diplomats and military personnel, as the U.S. has a recent poor track record in understanding religiously motivated actors like Salafi jihadi terrorists. 5, continue and enhance efforts to bolster trade and investment between the U.S. and Africa, which would help ameliorate one element of the enabling environment for terrorism, which is the lack of economic opportunity many Africans face. And 6, continue, improve, and expand support for Afghan civil society organizations. These groups are often among the few that are capable and committed enough to push their governments to perform better. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Dr. Zellin for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Pfluger. It's a pleasure to see you again. Thank you, Ranking Member Magaziner and the distinguished subcommittee for giving me the opportunity today to testify on terrorism threats emanating from parts of the African continent, in particular focusing on issues and recommendations related to the Sahel region, especially in Mali, where insecurity is getting worse by the day. There are two main jihadi groups now operating there, the Islamic State's Sahel province and Al-Qaeda's branch Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, or just JNIM. You can get more specifics on the background of both groups in my written testimony. This increased insecurity can be directly linked to the August 2022 withdrawal of French forces. At the time of the French departure, the Mali insurgency had not been deterred or defeated, but it has undoubtedly worsened since. The French withdrew at the request of the current Malian government, which seized power after a coup in May 2021 and expressed its preference for the Russian-backed Wagner Group as a preferred counterterrorism partner. According to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, 60% of Wagner's violent engagements in Mali have targeted civilian non-combatants. Rights groups therefore argue that such Wagner actions unintentionally drive support for both the Islamic State in Mali, or ISM, and JNIM, which capitalizes on grievances against local governments for recruitment purposes, highlighting that Washington and its allies cannot bifurcate counterterrorism and power competition as an either-or challenge, since it will only undermine the challenge of both. According to a late August 2023 UN report on ISM and JNIM, in less than a year, the Islamic State in Mali has almost doubled its area of control in rural eastern Manaka and large parts of the Ansango area in southern Gao. As for JNIM, the report states that it controls several gold mining sites across northern Mali and villages in at least the Mopti region. Making matters even more complicated for Washington, on September 16th, Mali signed a mutual defense treaty with Burkina Faso and Niger, an alternative and competitor to the French-led G5 Sahel alliance, one of the main bulwarks in recent years over the challenge of ISM and JNIM in the region. From an American security perspective, one area that is potentially worrying in the future is that a cohort of regional foreign fighters, mainly from surrounding countries, have appeared in the ranks of both ISM and JNIM. In past conflict zones with jihadis, this has led to external operations against Western homelands. It should be noted that JNIM and its parent organization, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, has been uninterested in external operations in Western homelands, though it has targeted Westerners and Western interests locally. The greater risk for potential external operations comes from ISM, even if it remains a low risk at this current juncture. History dictates, though, that the longer the group possesses a safe haven and the opportunity to expand its rule, the more capable it will be of planning operations, whether directed, guided, or inspired, as previously observed by IS's provinces in Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan. The current Malayan preference for Wagner, which effectively blocks Western nations from the theater, limits U.S. options for meaningfully shaping dynamics on the ground. Tenuous U.S. ties with the current Nigerian leadership further complicate the situation and may hinder the effectiveness of the local U.S. drone base, which has been used against both IS, Sahel province, and JNIM militants over the years. Washington should therefore prepare for the possibility that Niger could ask the U.S. to leave, as Mali recently did with France. Contingency planning for a drone base could include engaging countries like Ghana or Senegal, along for a backup plan amid the current trajectory. The U.S. Treasury Department should consider applying broader sanctions against ISM and JNIM leaders and financial networks. To date, only 4 senior figures have been designated from JNIM and 2 from ISM, with 2 of these 6 figures now dead. Furthermore, neither group has seen a designation against them since 2021, even as both groups have gotten stronger. Likewise, it is also worth confronting the Wagner Group and its logistics without hesitation. In late July, the U.S. sanctioned 3 Malayan officials for facilitating and expanding the Wagner Group's operations in the country since December 2021. This is a good start, though it would be worthwhile to target with sanctions those within the Wagner Group specifically in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, as the U.S. has done previously with its officials' activities in places like the Ukrainian war. Finally, there has been a growing perception, whether it is true or not, in the Sahel region, as well as elsewhere in the world, that the United States can be fickle with its allies in contrast to Russia. Therefore, before the security situation devolves even more and spreads to other countries, it is imperative that Washington sticks to its allies regionally and make these efforts visible. Otherwise, do not be surprised if Moscow tries to find cracks in the foundations of relations and leverages insecurity to take advantage and undermine the U.S.'s position as already seen in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Remembering that counterterrorism and power competition are linked in these conflict zones will also alleviate tactical and strategic misunderstandings and deter Russia from taking advantage of a warped view by Washington that these issue sets are somehow not linked. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zelen. I now recognize Ms. Charles for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I thank you and your staff for the opportunity to discuss the rise of terrorism in Africa and the potential threat it poses to the homeland. As Director for West Africa and the Sahel at the U.S. Institute of Peace, I lead the Institute's efforts to inform public policy and programs that are designed to help our partners counter violent extremism, prevent and stabilize regional conflicts, promote community-led peace-building initiatives, and advance good governance reforms in the region. During my tenure at the State Department, where I focused on terrorism in Africa, I witnessed how important it is for the United States to remain vigilant in its efforts to neutralize, contain, and deter threats against Americans at home and abroad. While my professional experiences will inform my testimony and responses today, they are wholly my own and do not reflect the positions or policies of the U.S. Institute of Peace or any other department or agency. My testimony focuses on three critical issues that I assess are foundational to addressing the complex landscape of terrorism in sub-Saharan Africa and how its evolution poses a threat to the homeland. The first is understanding capabilities and intent, which shapes our knowledge of terrorist operations and how to best counter them. The second is mapping out risks and vulnerabilities to U.S. persons and interests at home and in Africa, including our posture, our exposure, and our risk tolerance. And the third issue is building partnerships and capacities where they matter most. These issues require a robust set of tools and an equally robust policy that defines our strategic interests and political will to apply resources where they are lacking. The evolution of terrorism in Africa has resulted in significant shifts in capabilities and intent. A prime example of this shift is Al-Shabaab, the Somalia-based al-Qaeda affiliate. The group's capabilities have advanced substantially over the last 15 years and almost proportionately to its capacity to raise money. As a result, Al-Shabaab remains the wealthiest, largest, and most lethal al-Qaeda affiliate in the world. It is only in the last 3 years, however, that U.S. officials have publicly concluded that Al-Shabaab is a threat to the U.S. homeland. I refer you to my written testimony for details about how Al-Shabaab's plot, uncovered in the Philippines in 2019, helped shift this assessment. In addition, increased access to information technology, including social media, as well as global transportation, trade, financial, and communication networks create a target-rich environment for terrorist groups in Africa and elsewhere. Mapping and mitigating risks and vulnerabilities that expose the homeland to terror threats must be an iterative and well-resourced process. Consider our air borders. As of 2019, at least 11 countries in Africa have a last point of departure, or LPD, air route to the United States. This data point illustrates how a terrorist in Africa could, after clearing several layers of screening and security protocols, board a flight bound for the United States and use various means to attack the homeland, either before landing or upon doing so. Our land borders present another vulnerability. Thousands of migrants and special interest aliens, or SIAs, from various countries in Africa have made the dangerous trek to South or Central America onward to the southern border. I again refer you to my written testimony for countermeasures that I believe have improved situational awareness along our borders. I urge decision makers to embrace a both-and strategy rather than an either-or approach to ensure we are successful on both sides of the boom. Policymakers must take a hard look at how U.S. strategies for engaging in Africa are reconciled with the resources available. Also, we will fail if we abandon security cooperation with military and law enforcement partners on the continent. I am encouraged by investments in prevention, including through expanding civil-military operations, analyzing financial facilitation networks, and leveraging advanced open-source intelligence and technologies. Continuing to invest in these and other measures will pay dividends in protecting the homeland. I thank you for holding this hearing on this very important topic. I'm honored to appear before this committee, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Charles. I now recognize the ranking member.
Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that Ms. Jackson Lee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee and question the witnesses.
Without objection, so ordered. I ask the committee for something slightly out of order, and ask unanimous consent to offer Dr. Zellin about 2 minutes to provide this committee a little bit of educational background on the difference between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And if you will, give us about 2 minutes on that. We know that we've heard the terms, but tell us about your testimony. It was very interesting, and I think the education will be really good for us.
Thank you, Chairman. So the two groups originally were previously together. So the Islamic State of Iraq was part of Al-Qaeda, then the group broke away in 2013. Part of it was over doctrinal issues. One was related to the issue of takfir, or saying that another Muslim was not a real Muslim and therefore legitimizing their shedding of their blood. Another was the issue of the caliphate. The Islamic State wanted to announce the caliphate and that they were the ones, and that Al-Qaeda was subordinate to it because they were just a group. So essentially, the Islamic State views itself as needing to have administrative control in the areas that it operates right away, and it doesn't matter if they have the support of the local populations. Think of ISIS as like a totalitarian regime, whereas Al-Qaeda is more like an authoritarian regime when it operates. Al-Qaeda, in turn, as a consequence of lessons learned from the Iraq War, believes that instead it needs to first gain some level of support from the population, sort of a, hearts and minds approach. Obviously, they're the ones who are still in control, but they believe if they can explain to the local population first their ideology, that in turn people will agree with them because, from their perspective, what they believe is the true Islam, even though, as we all know, it's a twisted version of it. So therefore, Al-Qaeda has more of this gradualist approach related to, working with the population, taking over territory, implementing Islamic law based off of their interpretation, whereas the Islamic State has more of a direct approach where they want to do it right away, and it doesn't matter who's in the way, essentially. So think of it as more of like a totalitarian versus an authoritarian approach to their broader agendas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning, and an additional round of questioning may be called after all members have had the chance to be recognized. I now recognize myself for the first round of questioning. I want to go to Ms. Charles. You said something very interesting. It's pertinent today, and this was not in my line of questioning, but you talked about the trek that people are making from Africa to Central and South American countries and the vigilance that we need to have on our southern border. Can you please expand on that and what that threat is? I have personally been to these regions. I've been to the Darien. I saw people from West Africa, from Sub-Saharan Africa that were in the Darien this summer. So please tell us that vigilance that we need to be preparing for here.
Thank you, Chairman Pfluger. I'm happy to. One of the things I want to emphasize at the outset is that the migration crisis that we are seeing, especially as it pertains to African migrants leaving the continent, is one that should be considered from a humanitarian perspective as well. I think it's important to understand that the vast majority of people that are leaving dire conditions in sub-Saharan Africa, either because of environmental stresses, because of violent conflict, because they have been victimized or targeted by their governments. At the end of the day, people who are willing to make this trek to South and Central America, to the southern border, are clearly desperate. Now, I think it's also important to recognize that within that group, we have seen that there are opportunities for threat actors to use these routes to get to the United States or get to regions close to the United States to conduct operations, to facilitate other elements of their organizations, and it's important to be clear-eyed about the threat that this poses. While I will not speak for what any department or agency is doing today, I will say that in my professional experience, I am aware of the routes that have been taken by certain actors who are associated with terrorist organizations operating in sub-Saharan Africa. And you'll see various methodologies for that. The majority of people leaving sub-Saharan Africa tend to migrate toward Europe, right, using either the North African routes to Libya.
Do they pose a terrorist threat in Europe as well?
My understanding is that there are elements within these large groups. You have to understand that these are thousands of people.
Yeah.
And there are elements within that group that have links and associations with terrorist organizations in Africa.
I'm going to keep moving. I want to pick up on this here in a minute, but Mr. Meserve had a very interesting point. You said that they are required, that these jihadists are required to fight the United States. So picking up on where Ms. Charles talked about, can you kind of, and you said in your testimony the African terror threat has likely become more acute because of the Taliban's conquest of Afghanistan, and you went on to talk about the relationship is unlikely to dissolve soon, and the Osama bin Laden effect, the allegiances that were sworn. It's been 2 years since you published that particular article. Do you feel that the Taliban's resurgence has impacted jihadist states in the Sahel?
I think certainly the Taliban's reconquest has provided, at the very least, a moral boost to these groups. It's encouraging to see an organization like the Taliban defeat the United States, essentially. And I think that is how this is interpreted. This is seen as a defeat of the United States. So I think at the very least, it has provided them motivation. And we saw some of Afghan terrorist organizations actually celebrating the Taliban's reconquest of Afghanistan. I have not seen any reports of direct links right now between the Taliban and Afghan terrorist organizations, but as I noted in my testimony, I think there's a very real danger that will happen again. There is a history of it, of Afghan terrorists fighting and training in Afghanistan and then going back to the continent. So.
Ambassador Pham, while they may not have the capability to conduct attacks on the United States homeland right now, if they do, please tell us that. Is this headed to a point where these groups, whoever they may be, Al-Qaeda affiliated, ISIS affiliated, do they have the motivation to attack the U.S. homeland or U.S. interest?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Mr. Meserve pointed out, the motivation, the theological underpinnings are there. What they've lacked to date, thank God, is the capability, but they're constantly seeking. We've seen this, for example, with al-Shabaab in Somalia, where they've increasingly built increasingly sophisticated, even undetectable, the laptop bomb case a few years ago. So they're striving for it. To date, they haven't, but they will continue to do so. And the reasons Ms. Charles pointed out earlier, I would just add to that, we don't know what we don't know. And our databases of individuals, especially for African terrorists, are not as robust because we haven't invested the resources that we have, for example, for screening individuals from the Middle East or South Asia. And that's a vulnerability.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I recognize the ranking member for your line of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'll pick up on that point. So, Ms. Charles in her written testimony noted the 2019 incident where an al-Shabaab operative was found to be completing flight training in the Philippines, and we assessed that was one of the first indicators that al-Shabaab had the capability and intent to strike targets outside of the East Africa region, including potentially the United States. So what more can we be doing or should we be doing to identify these plots and disrupt them before they occur? Because to the prior point, the eyes of the world have been focused on the Middle East and elsewhere, and what do we as a government need to be doing to support that intelligence gathering and disrupt those plots with regard to these African terrorist groups?
Thank you for your question, Ranking Member Magaziner. What made the 2019 plot so significant was the fact that Filipino authorities were the ones that detained Cholo Abdullah in his hotel room, his quarters. And while I cannot speak to in this setting the specific circumstances that led the Filipino authorities to Mr. Abdullah, I will say that it is critical to understand that those partnerships, the partnerships that the United States has with Filipino authorities, as well as, when you think about it, other authorities throughout sub-Saharan Africa and globally, really help us extend our visibility and extend our awareness and understanding of the threats that are plotting against either their interests or U.S. interests, either in that region or in the homeland. So I will say that what organizations and departments and agencies like the Department of State and others have done, not just since that attack, but even prior, or that attempted attack and prior to that, is increase the partnerships that we have in these regions from a military and a law enforcement perspective. And that just not includes liaison relationships where we're exchanging information, but also training and equipping and building capacities. When we build capacities, then we are allowed to engage these organizations and these entities in a way that is not just beneficial to them when they're building out a prosecution case, but it's also beneficial to us as well. So that's my recommendation in that regard.
Thank you. Dr. Zelen, I was struck by something in your remarks just now where you said that at times the U.S. can be viewed as a fickle partner in the region. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, thank you. I think part of it is not just related to specifically in the Sahel, but other areas on the world stage in the past, whether it's related to actors in the Middle East in terms of the U.S. in Iraq or the U.S. in Syria. We were just discussing what happened in Afghanistan. Obviously, it didn't make sense for the U.S. to continue to remain fighting against the Taliban since nothing was really changing on the ground. However, there's been a perception by many U.S. allies that the U.S. won't stick it out even if it's very tough, even though obviously we're there for 20 years. And as a consequence, you've increasingly see Russia pushing to try and fill those vacuums by undermining the U.S. and going in there and showing that they can do what they do on the ground, especially in the context of Syria in particular. The Assad regime was toast more or less until the Russians came in, and now we've seen as a consequence of that, they've then parlayed that into greater relations with other states in the Gulf region, in Egypt, and then of course what we're seeing in Eastern Europe now related to Ukraine.
I've heard several of you in your remarks allude to the need for the U.S. to be a good partner to friendly nations in terms of economic and humanitarian assistance as well. We're being asked to consider appropriations bills that, in their current form, contain deep cuts to food assistance programs and other aid through the State Department budget and the Department of Agriculture budget. I'll open this up to any of you. Can any of you speak to the importance from a national security perspective that the United States be a good partner and not allow Russia or China to subvert our engagement with friendly nations that share our values? I'll open it up to anyone.
I'll take you up on that, Ranking Member Magaziner. I'm a firm believer that accountable foreign assistance is critical to American leadership and our national interests. In many of these countries, they're the difference that has gained us entree with civil society, with populations. They help shore up friendly governments that partner with us. So in a number of things, they reinforce. I've had the honor of working closely with and advising military deployments throughout the continent, and I've yet to meet a commander who didn't emphasize the value of those other programs in shaping the environment in a way that made his or her operations easier and safer.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following the lead of Mr. Magaziner in asking about the risks of decreasing financial commitments, perhaps, to this problem abroad, let me ask it something a little differently, or going at it that same issue another way, maybe. I think many Americans, although without your level of expertise perhaps, believe that the $8 trillion that we spent in Afghanistan and Iraq didn't work out well. And there are other examples to boot. I mean, Libya always comes to mind for me. There has been a consistent policy architecture behind all of those acts, all of those policies that continues to hold amazing sway. In fact, I think the premise behind Mr. Magaziner's question and your answer to it, Ambassador, was that we've got to keep doing the same thing. Am I wrong, is that perception wrong that that policy didn't work out well in Afghanistan and Iraq? And is it that the United States just wasn't permitted to stay for 40 years or 50 years or 100 years as opposed to some other fundamental defect there?
Sir, if I may clarify my remarks, I think our foreign assistance is critical to our leadership, but it is foreign assistance with our partners. And very often, what we don't have is partners. A wonderful example, I would say, is the leading beneficiary of PEPFAR, which is for renewal, and beneficiary of AGOA, which is up for renewal next year, is South Africa, a country I would hardly cite as a partner of the United States. In fact, a partner of our adversaries. And why they should be the leading beneficiary in Africa befuddles me, sir.
Anybody else want to comment on what I've asked? Ms. Charles?
Thank you, Representative Bishop. One of the points that I'd like to emphasize, especially as a veteran and somebody who has deployed to the Middle East and have worked on training equipped programs, is that we learned important lessons from the situation in Afghanistan. I think that I would like to commend the entities and organizations that have done extensive research on those lessons that we've learned. And one of the things that I think we learned is that tactically, operationally, strategically, it is difficult, if not impossible, to, I would say, prop up a government, a military with tools, resources, equipment that they will not have the capacity to use for a long period of time. And I would make this distinction with what we're doing in Somalia. Again, not the best situation when it comes to where al-Shabaab is on the trajectory over 15 years, but we've helped build out a Somali national army that did not exist in its current form 15 years ago. And so I would say that we have learned lessons and that those lessons can be applied to situations not just in sub-Saharan Africa and all over the world. Yes, large mistakes were made when it comes to our foreign assistance and how we operated there, but we've learned those lessons and I'm seeing them applied in parts of sub-Saharan Africa.
And I hear you, and I'd like to believe we've learned the lessons, and you just gave an example but what it evokes in me is a recognition that of the resources we invested in the Afghanistan army, and Americans saw it just collapse. And I'm sure there are expert views about why that's a distinct situation, but it doesn't really provide me comfort. Let me ask you this, how many countries in Africa are U.S. forces conducting operations in now?
Thank you, Representative Bishop. From my perch, I would refer you to the Department of Defense to provide specifics on that. When we look at open source information, it is clear that Somalia is one of those countries. We also have partnerships throughout West Africa where we're training and equipping. We're providing support in various ways. But I would refer you to the Department of Defense for specifics on that.
Let me just ask one more for whoever wants to take it. How is it that China and Russia are able to win support in Africa based off anti-U.S. resentment? What are the reasons that people there resent the United States and be inclined to join Russia or China in their efforts?
Yeah, thank you. I think how Africans feel about the United States varies widely across the continent, and there actually is a lot of support for the U.S. Among the general African population. Now, there's also growing levels of support, or not growing on an uninterrupted trajectory, but there is support for China, as you say. I think that's due to decades of very intensive Chinese engagement, diplomatic investments, loans, things of that nature. but there's also a growing wariness of Chinese engagement because of fears that perhaps some of these countries are too engaged with China. On the Russia side, yes, we saw Russian flags being waved during some of these coups and such things. I would suspect that some of that was Russian propaganda, frankly. Like, I don't know where they would have gotten those flags other than from the Russians themselves. But it's also true that, yes, there is resentment towards former colonizers like the French, for instance, who have a very difficult history in that region. So it's very, very complex. I don't think the U.S. is out of the game, so to speak, as far as our person-to-person diplomacy and our ability to win influence and support from the general African population.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Chair now recognizes Mr. Cray for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both our chairman and our ranking member for holding this most important hearing. I want to thank the members today here, witnesses for your testimony. Africa, continent that's exploding in terms of importance, population, center of resources. Russia, China, the U.S., everybody's trying to control, influence the area. For the U.S., I hate to say this, but we only pay attention when we see smoke. And by then, the fire is raging out of control. Mr. Chairman, I want to submit an article for the record today.
Without objection.
It's Calgary Herald by David Beasley, former South Carolina governor and former director of the UN World Food Program. And it's entitled Ahead of Business Forum in Banff, former top UN official warns of widespread starvation due to conflict. Mr. David Beasley and I have been talking for a number of months. I'm going to quote him, and he says, "I cannot tell you how many times mothers would say to me, my son or husband did not want to join ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but we had not fed our little girl in 2 weeks. What were we supposed to do? The extremist groups use food to recruit, and especially in the Sahel region, as well as in the Horn of Africa, places such as Somalia, where you have Al-Shabaab." He goes on to say, during the Arab Spring, there were over 48 nations of unrest and political instability due to rising food prices. The international hunger crisis is much worse today than it was in 2010. He goes on to say, the cost of feeding a Syrian in Syria is about 50 cents a day. The cost humanitarian to support that Syrian in Germany is about $70 or more per day. Heard all of you very carefully. You've barely mentioned starvation, food. So I'm going to ask all of you, today, the U.S. is the breadbasket of the world. Do you know how much foreign aid, U.S. aid, we provided Africa? Mr. Pham. Mr. Reservity.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead. I only have 2 minutes.
Yeah, the approximate U.S. aid to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is approximately $7 billion.
Is that going up or down?
The trend has been relatively steady.
Is that enough?
I would say it is enough if spent wisely.
Mr. Reservi.
Yeah, I agree with the last comment. It has to
Mr. Zellen, Dr. Zellen.
I think we need to think about the continuing degradation of the environment and how climate change is affecting.
So hunger is only going to get worse and worse, and hungry people do desperate things.
There's also
to
the issue
feed
of the
their
grain
families.
prices from the Russian-Ukrainian conflict that's affected a lot of nations in Africa as well, since they don't have access to it now because of the Russian blockade on Ukraine.
So, Ms. Charles, go ahead.
I would say that the humanitarian assistance is an important part of it, but we also need to work on the opposite end or the other side of that, which is improving the technology transfer and allowing the information that we have about agriculture to help transform lives, subsistence farmers, et cetera. So we do a lot in humanitarian assistance, emergency food assistance. For instance, we are the largest donor to, bilateral donor to Somalia.
Ms. Charles, I would say that all of that is good, but if you're starving today, by the time you get technology transfer and other resources on the ground, it's probably going to be too late. And my concern as a policymaker, and we're debating how much foreign aid we are giving countries today in terms of food, is trying to get attention, trying to understand the pragmatics, the reality where the rubber meets the road. That family in Africa not having enough to eat, and how we can help possibly with food, as you know, Governor Beasley said, either you feed these people or you're going to continue to throw gasoline on top of a fire that will eventually overwhelm us. So, you know, I would ask all of you to go back and think about how important is it today to feed the starving people like in South Africa for our own personal interest. Mr. Chairman, my time is up. Thank you very much.
The gentleman's time's expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Meservey, in May 2023, you wrote a paper titled "America's Best Choice in Sudan is the Least Bad Option." In that paper, you mentioned that a sustained conflict in Sudan would lead to a major humanitarian and migration crisis. How could a potential refugee crisis from any country experiencing instability in that region impact this nation's ongoing crisis at the southern border?
Yeah, I think as we've been discussing during this testimony, or during this hearing, that when you get increased migration flows, whether within Africa or across the southern border, for instance, it does raise the risk of terrorists using those flows to embed themselves. We've seen this during the Syria crisis. We know for a fact that some terrorists use that crisis and the migration flows into Europe to get into Europe and wage attacks. So, yeah, that's always should be a concern of these around these conflicts.
Ambassador, you highlighted that the centuries-old trade routes across the Sahara Desert are now being used by malign actors for human trafficking and the smuggling of narcotics and other contraband to Europe. Can you briefly describe which specific drugs are coming through that route?
Two in particular, cocaine from Latin America, some of it moving from Colombia via Venezuela to the Sahel, and the other one is cannabis, some of it grown on the continent, those are the two primary ones, sir.
Okay. And these same routes have also have a variety of energy pipelines that support Europe's efforts to pivot from Russian oil and gas. Can you briefly discuss the threats posed to those pipelines and how these threats could potentially impact global energy?
Europe is relying the flurry of deals signed since February 2022 with African countries. One of the ones that's most preoccupies, I think, energy analysts is the Trans-Sahara pipeline running through Niger into Algeria and then over to Spain. That's been now put in doubt, both because of the coup in Niger, the petroleum minister being arrested, and now the increased jihadist activity in that country and in Mali, in the northern part of Mali as well.
Okay. And now this is for any of you. So the Homeland Threat Assessment of 2024 published this month by DHS stated, and I quote, "As of July, approximately 160 non-U.S. persons in the TSDS attempted to enter the United States via the southern border this year, most of whom were encountered attempting to illegally enter between points of entry. This represents an increase from the approximately 100 encounters in all of fiscal year 2022. Do you think the rise in terrorism in Africa could be contributing to the increase in this number?" Ms. Charles, you hit the button first, so go ahead.
Representative, thank you for the question. I think the situation, when you look at it from a sheer numbers perspective, can seem easier on its face to analyze. It's a nuanced and complex situation, and I think that the numbers that we're looking at, especially from the TSDS, as you refer to, that information is fed from various databases, as I understand it, and the United States can do a better job at scrubbing this information and ensuring that it is accurate. I have seen in my professional experience that some of the information is contestable, and so it's important to sort of provide that nuance and context there. But at the end of the day, the rise of terrorism in Africa does not necessarily mean that we are going to see a threat to the United States that's proportionate. It's important for us to ensure that the partnerships that we have in South America, in Central America, and the tools and technologies that we're using, like Bitmap, ATSG, Pisces, et cetera, are employed in a way that can help us identify those potential threats well before they get to the southern border. So that's the point that I want to emphasize.
And I only have 30 seconds left. Dr. Zelen, through your research, have you seen any threat indicators from jihadist groups from the region that we're discussing today that would present a direct threat to the U.S. homeland?
Currently, no. It's a low risk. However, if they continue to control territory, especially in Mali region with the Islamic State, they've shown previously in cases in Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan, if they have the time and space, they will attempt to either direct an attack or try to guide people in the homeland that are already here or try to inspire them. So it's something that needs to be focused on continuously.
Thank you very much, Doctor. My time's expired. I now recognize Ms. Titus for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Getting back to the topic of what's happening in Africa and what we can do there, I would ask you, Ms. Charles, to talk a little bit about the Global Fragility Act. That was established, for those who don't know, in 2019, set aside 10 countries where we should be focused, directing our efforts and in those countries to try to stabilize the situation, look at what the threats are to growing democracy, how the U.S. can do better, coordinating with locals on the ground there for their input. Now that's going to be running out fairly soon, and it's woefully underfunded. Could you talk about how it works and what its contributions are to countering this terrorist rise?
Thank you, Representative Titus. One of the things that I will say about the Global Fragility Act and its related strategies is that it is meant to, with the resources provided year over year, to help capacitate not just national governments, but also working with local governments, civil society, using a whole of society approach to ensure that those elements that foster fragility, if you will, can be addressed in a sustainable way. I completely agree that the resources provided, especially year over year, for a region like West Africa, coastal West Africa, where you have 5 countries where ostensibly tens of billions of dollars needs to be spread out over a period of time, may not necessarily be adequate, may not be enough. But at the end of the day, the idea behind the Global Fragility Act is one that allows us to look at the problem set from a balanced perspective, where we look at the 3 Ds, development, diplomacy, and defense. We're balancing out those elements of development and diplomacy, but we need to ensure that our embassies in the region are capacitated and resourced in a way that allows the efforts associated with the GFA to be effective. We cannot mete out tens of billions of dollars to affect any change without having the ambassadors in place, poll officers in place, reporting officers in place, programs officers in place in countries like Niger, where my understanding is that embassy staffing is well below 75, even 50%. And so I will say that GFA on its face is a fantastic idea and concept, but in practicality, in implementation, there are challenges that we need to address, especially when it comes to presence. And one thing I will point out when it comes to strategic competition is that if we aim to use this tool as part of an effort to compete strategically with the likes of the Russian Federation and the PRC, we need to ensure that we look at how they're manning their embassies in the region and how we're manning ours. If we cannot compete in that regard, then I think all things like GFA might not be as successful as they could be.
Well, we lost a lot of State Department folks during the previous administration when that was pretty much emasculated, and we heard from the president at that time that everything was transactional and wasn't going to be invested or working with our allies in any part of the country, but the world, but certainly in Africa was the case. And isn't it better to look at the causes of this terrorism than trying to deal with them after they are more established? And we've seen that al-Shabaab, especially in some of these countries, is seen as a stabilizing force. It has its own governmental structure, provides employment, and that's a big source of radicalization when young people are not employed. It's not ideological necessarily. So if we are there competing with these other things that we could do under the Fragility Act, maybe that would be a way to circumvent it as opposed to have to deal with it after the fact.
Rep. Titus, very quickly on those 2 points. I agree that it is important to look at the root causes, but again, as I mentioned in my opening statement, the both-and strategy is the most, I think, effective, right? The United States is one of the most sophisticated and capable governments out there, especially when it comes to not just our intelligence or security services, but also our ability to deploy what I call soft power. And I think that's an important thing to realize is that, we are head and shoulders above a lot of our partners in terms of what we're doing. And I think we can do both things. We can walk and chew gum when it comes to not just the securitized relationships that we have, military and law enforcement, but the soft power skills that we're very good at deploying as well. When it comes to, working with journalists and civil society, we do that very well too. When it comes to the point you raised about al-Shabaab, which I think is a critical one, over time, yes, it has been shown that al-Shabaab has created structures, especially when they governed most of southern Somalia, that people saw them as a stabilizing force. However, I would argue with the idea that they were preferred. Yes, they could adjudicate civil cases, right, with land reform, if you will. They were there when there were no other security forces there. The problem, however, is that al-Shabaab offered an extortion level of security, if you will. These are people that would exact the kind of justice that would make our hair stand on end. These are people that would bury women in the ground to the shoulders and stone them if there was an accusation of infidelity. And so I would beg people to understand that while there may have been a level of stability, it was because there was a vacuum. And that's an important point to make.
I think the point is that if we're not there to fill that vacuum, then we can't expect to have good results. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the great state of Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
First of all, I can't thank the chairman and ranking member enough for what I think is an enormously crucial hearing. This is not the Foreign Affairs Committee. And so I know that your extending to this area is crucial, and it just plays into my frustration. I thank my colleague from Nevada for going where I will try to go in a very short period of time, and that is the crucial urgency of the relationship between the United States and the continent. Recognize that there are more than 50 nations, but the continent. And I guess my chastising is that Republican and Democratic administrations over the past 2 decades have failed to understand the cruciality of our relationship in terms of the funding in State Department efforts, though let me compliment our foreign diplomacy team that I have seen all over Africa who are working beyond hours with short staff, but we have missed the most important moment in history. I don't know if we can get it back, and that's why we're here talking about it. The Congressional Black Caucus, led by some of us intensely engaged, were the ones that pushed for AFRICOM. And that was an approach as a first effort of really on the ground. And I heard you, Ms. Charles, speak about soft power. I'm going to have a question, just looking for the clock. But having gone to school at the University of Ghana in Accra and Kumasi, University of Nigeria, with campuses at Lagos and Ibadan, I know that Africa could have been the continent, the greatest ally to the United States of America. My first question is going to be to each of the witnesses, starting with you, Mr. Pham, thank you for your service. Is Africa a strategic and economic force that the United States should try to embrace with a very strong connection? I just need yes or no.
Yes, ma'am.
And sir, I'm just going down the,
Yes.
Yes, definitely.
Absolutely, yes.
and this is Republicans and Democrats who are witnesses. In 2014, I was the first member of Congress to lead a delegation in to deal with the kidnapping of the Chibok girls, which was by a terrorist group. That would have also been a moment that we could have poured in our concern. We as members went in, only 3 of us, to show compassion to the family. And the issue was in northern Nigeria, where they felt completely abandoned. It was being taken over by ISIS or radicals, and that was their way of showing the Nigerian government and everyone else, burning Christian churches, etc., how powerful they were. So let me try to pose to you, Ms. Charles, what should be the most targeted way that we can overcome China's presence that takes and does not give? Wagner, that is in the Central African Republic. People may not think that pulls in a terrorist look, but it is a look that is different from America and argues against American values. And that's what terrorism is. It changes people's attitudes and moves them away from democratic principles, being able to see the forest for the trees, meaning that it is better to help collaborate and work and build a bridge rather than be given a bridge and then extract every literal blood out of the country and give nothing back. So what can we do? Terrorism is a multifaceted fight. It is the hearts and souls of Americans, of the continent, and it is a strategic way of getting in. And if I'm going to yield just a moment more, I do want to put on the record, pay tribute to my predecessor, the Honorable Mickey Leland, who sat in this place. And as far back as 1989 and beyond, he took up the cause of sub-Saharan Africa by bringing in food. He was making friends between Eritrea, Sahara Desert, and Ethiopia. And he died on the side of an Ethiopian mountain taking grain to the starving African. That should have been what we would have done. We would not be facing ISIS or
Gentlelady's time has expired, but the chair will allow one more minute.
I appreciate ISIS or Al-Qaeda. If you can give us a schooling, please, I'd appreciate it. I thank the chairman for his indulgence.
Thank you, Representative Jackson-Lee, for your question. I will be brief in my response in that focusing on the point that you raised about strategic competition and looking at how China and Russia operate in sub-Saharan Africa. The United States would do very...
And how that opens the doors for the terrorists.
Well, that's one element, and I think it's, again, a very nuanced conversation to have, but I would say that the United States would do well to leverage one of the most important things that we have that I would say that the Russian Federation and the PRC do not have, which is a vibrant, robust, and well-educated diaspora. The diaspora community has been very vocal in its concerns about how the United States appears to have a fickle way of addressing some of the issues in sub-Saharan Africa. If we are more consistent in our engagement across the board, and again, use that whole of society approach, engaging civil society, engaging the grassroots organizations that Russia and China often ignore, I think that we would do well and we would pay dividends to our influence on the continent.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. I thank the witnesses and our committee for the questions that have been asked today. It is a busy day, and the second round does not look like it will happen, but I do want to offer the ranking member the opportunity to make a closing statement at this time.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I'm very glad that we held this hearing today. I'm very grateful to our witnesses and the experience and the insights that they have brought. And to our colleagues, as the chairman noted, this is a busy day and a busy week in Congress, but the fact that so many of our colleagues came prepared to engage on this topic, I think, is a very positive sign. As a government and as a Congress, we need to constantly be anticipating threats to the United States homeland before they develop and plan for them in advance and diffuse them before the threats become imminent. And if we do not engage and continue to engage and increase our engagement in Africa, we will all regret it. And so I want to thank all of you for your insights. I was particularly struck when Ms. Charles talked about the 3 Ds, defense, diplomacy, and development. And I think that is a great framework through which to look at this work. We need to make sure that we have robust defense and intelligence gathering capabilities in areas like the Sahel and West Africa where terrorist threats are on the rise. We need to continue to engage diplomatically with our allies in the region that share our values and our interests. And we need to continue to invest in development, not pull back, because those root causes of radicalization that include poverty and hunger continue to be a major challenge. We cannot have a foreign policy or a defense strategy that is based just on sticks and not carrots. It needs to be all of the above, not either or. Russia and China are moving into this region not out of altruism, not out of charity, but because they understand that it is in their strategic interest to have a presence and to have relationships in all regions, but particularly in Africa in the 21st century. There is a national security imperative that the United States do the same, that we continue to engage with defense, diplomacy, and development to ensure that our adversaries, be they nation states or terrorist organizations, do not gain the upper hand. So thank you, Chairman, for calling this hearing. Thank you again to our witnesses and our colleagues. And let this be a redoubling of our efforts in this area as we go forward. Thank you.
I thank the ranking member. I'll make a brief closing statement as well. I couldn't agree with my colleague, the ranking member, Mr. Magaziner, more on what he just said about anticipating. That's the reason that we held this hearing today, is because your testimony, your written testimony, the questions that you've answered, the colleagues on both sides of the aisle. If there's something that unifies this Congress, it is exactly this subject right here on how to anticipate and then take action and prevent these terrorist acts from impacting Americans, American interests, and our partners and allies, which unfortunately we have seen a track record and a motivation, and maybe the capability and capacity isn't quite there yet, as was mentioned, but it is going to be there. And if left unchecked, it will certainly impact us. And so I appreciate everyone participating in this today, and that's why we held this hearing. You know, I look at the threat environment around the world, it's growing. I think personally, myself, and having been deployed all over the world, that we are probably in a threat environment that rivals that of the pre-World War II environment, if not greater, because of the complexity of the nature of threats and the domains that it's not just the land, air, and sea domain. We have a cyber domain. We've got many places around the world that are now for the first time experiencing these horrors, as was mentioned by Ms. Charles. These are graphic images, but we have to keep those in mind. And I'm worried about that threat environment and that landscape and the vacuum that we see in the regions that you have pointed out throughout the continent of Africa that are allowing a breeding ground for terrorism, which has to be checked with the partnering with not just these nations, but also with like-minded countries around the world. The great power competition has obviously spilled over into this threat, this extremism threat. So I'm very, very pleased with the results of this hearing today. I want to continue the work here, and I would implore all of you to please continue your work because you are informing the United States government on those threats and the policy decisions that we will make and the direction that we will go is hinging upon your work, your research, and your expertise. So I thank the witnesses. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for you, and we would ask that you respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for 10 days. Without objection, this committee stands adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member.